Module 7, Strategic Management, Leadership, and Theories of Governance. For this module, you need to read Fredrickson Chapter 9, as well as Schaffert's Chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 in the Fredrickson text talks about theories of governance. With the rise of the reinventing government movement, and prior to that, the new public management movement, governments in the 70s, 80s, and 90s became less hierarchical and more decentralized, and increasingly willing to cede their role as a dominant policy actor to private sector organizations through decentralization and privatization. The traditional public administration dichotomy fell out of favor, became less significant. This meant that bureaucracies within centralized policy jurisdictions could no longer be considered outside or above politics, but they remained the central suppliers of public goods and services and continued to define what administrative theory was called upon to explain. This led to what the chapter describes as the hollow state. It's a result of decentralization, which means that the powers and responsibilities of the city, state, and nation were becoming less defined and increasingly merged with other jurisdictions, including the private sector. The hollow state is a metaphor for government that contracts public service provisions out to networks of mostly nonprofit organizations or private organizations and reduces its role as a direct supplier of public goods. It redefines what public means in public administration. Traditionally, that meant government and exclusively government, but this definition must now include a broad variety of institutions and organizations traditionally considered outside of government. This led to the idea of governance. It's an increasingly used term for public administration or public management. Governance as a way to distinguish between public administration orthodoxy or government built upon the principles of the politics administration dichotomy, as well as government expertise, merit selection, specialization, institution building, and the Weberian science of management, that traditional model, and more of a new theory of public administration based on understanding the diffuse networks increasingly responsible for providing public services. In other words, at the local government level, more and more services are privatized or contracted out, or at least through partnerships. Things like garbage collection is traditionally the most common. Local governments used to be the primary provider of utility services. Now that more and more falls to private companies. There's also this idea of governance as the new public management. Donald Keddy argues that the new public management is predicated upon 6 core basic issues: productivity, marketization, service orientation, decentralization, policy, and accountability. And you can read more about those in the text. There are two primary models of the new public management, which you've already talked about. The Westminster model, which is originated in New Zealand in the late 70s and quickly spread to other parliamentary democracies such as Australia and Canada and the United Kingdom. It called for sweeping privatization of state-controlled industries. Things like British Airways, which is now a private organization, used to be owned by the British government, and it became privatized in 1987. Same thing with British Petroleum, or BP. It became privatized in the late 80s. It's more the separation of government operations into functional units and a delegation of decision-making power to actors within those functional areas. The reinventing government model really is unique to the U.S. Because in the U.S. there's largely already less to privatize. Because local, state, and national governments in the United States share responsibility in most policy arenas and are subject to different political motivations. There is no central government powerful enough to force functional reorganization on the scale pursued by parliamentary governments. In the U.S., they tended to emphasize competition to a greater degree and to fundamentally alter the regulatory role of governments. Chapter 9 in the Shaffer's text focuses on strategic management, which is about the management of resources to attain certain goals in its entirety. It involves management by objectives and strategic planning. Management by objectives focuses on goals and objectives. It was pioneered by famed author Peter Drucker in 1954 when he published his book, The Practice of Management. It involves measurable goals which have to be established and accomplished by both membership and leadership of the organization to be realized over a period of time. In other words, specific goals are established by the organization, by whatever the structure is, and that includes timelines as well as the processes to achieve those goals. Part of management's responsibility is providing a broad statement of philosophy within the public organization's mission statement. Statement of goals is more specific, while the list of objectives establishes a means to achieve the goals, sometimes referred to as targets. This also involves strategic planning. In administration, the concept of strategy and tactics involve the selection of philosophies, policies, and practices to achieve efficiency and effectiveness. So that goes along very well with management objectives, or management by objectives. There are many models for strategic planning available. They all follow largely the same basic concepts, and they plan for long-term sustainability of the organization. The text specifically outlines 7 steps or components in the strategic plan. However, as I said, there are lots of different models, and when you take that course, I'm sure you'll learn about several different options as well. There's also the idea of strategic management effectiveness, and it's the idea where best practices, benchmarking, and management scorecards all come together to establish your goals. Leadership is the focus of Chapter 10 in the Shaffer's book. The text starts out with a discussion about Chester Bernard's study of functions of the executive from 1938 and defines 3 essential functions of leaders or executives. They include to promote a system of communication, to promote the securing of essential efforts, and to formulate and define the purposes and goals of the organization. Translated into modern language, communication is still communication. To promote securing of essential efforts is to make sure the resources are in place to achieve your goals. And to formulate and define the purposes and goals of the organization is in census strategic planning. Then the chapter goes on to identify different leadership theories. 4 are discussed here, but there are many others. The ones that they discuss include trait theory, transactional theories, contingency approaches, and transformational leadership. Again, these are just 4, and there are certainly a variety of variations within these 4, and there are many others as well that I'm sure you'll read about, again, as you take additional courses in the program.